was lying in the uncomfortable bed they'd given me, in the frigid bedroom they'd given me. I lay on my side, facing the bare wall, the blankets pulled up to my chin. It was so cold in the room that each breath sent a plume of vapor from my mouth. The blankets kept me from shivering, but not by much. The sound of footsteps on the floor outside had me tensing. I lifted my head off the lumpy pillow and gazed over my shoulder and past the foot of the bed, at the door. The footsteps stopped right outside the door, and then the whispers started. I pulled the blankets up over my head, dropping back to the pillow. I started shivering, but not because of the cold. The door to the bedroom swung open with a long creaking sound that seemed to go on for 30 seconds. There was no noise for a long time after that. No more whispers, no footsteps, nothing but the rushing silence of the old house and the occasional subtle tap-scrape of dead leaves blowing against the window or sliding along the roof. Finally, when I was sure they were gone, I lowered the blanket little by little, my eyes fixed on the wall. Gathering my courage, I moved my head to look toward the door. I noticed the 3 figures standing behind me, right next to my bed. They were all dressed in their pajamas, and they were all smiling at me. The father, Elijah, leaned over the bed, reaching his hands toward me. The mother, Nora, stood with her hands on her son Jackson's shoulders. The only one who wasn't there was the daughter, Ivy. Gasping, I scrambled away from them until my back hit the bare joists of the wall the bed was up against.
"What?"
I asked, nearly crying.
"What now?"
They didn't say anything. They simply kept smiling, grinning. Elijah grabbed me by my t-shirt and yanked me out of the bed. "It's time," he said, standing me up and grabbing me by the back of the neck. "For you to go to the basement."
"But I didn't do anything,"
I said.
"I did what you asked."
Elijah just smiled and shoved me toward the door. "Don't make this worse on yourself. Go." The first time I met Uncle Elijah, I was sitting in a social worker's office. I'd only learned of his existence the day before, when the social worker, Mrs. Young, told me my uncle was flying to town. My mother had died 2 days earlier in a hit-and-run accident on her way home from work. The reality of that hadn't sunk in yet. It had always been me and my mom, and now she was gone. And at 15, there was no one else who could take me in. No one but my Uncle Elijah. "I'm so sorry about your mom," Elijah said, while Mrs. Young stood by and watched the interaction. "As I'm sure you know, we lost touch years ago. I tried to contact her many times over the years, but she made the decision to stay away from our family long before you were born."
"Why?"
I asked.
"Why didn't she tell me about you?"
Elijah's smile faded. "Well, it's complicated. But your grandfather was very hard on your mother. He was hard on us both, but on your mother especially. He didn't know it at the time, but he was driving her away, and he died regretting the way he treated her. I'm just sorry that she's gone now, and that she'll never know how sorry he really was." I looked at the floor of Mrs. Young's office, fighting back tears.
"Maybe she does know,"
I said.
"Maybe she's in heaven, and she does know how he felt."
"Yeah," Elijah said. "Maybe so." There was a moment of silence before he spoke again, saying, "I'm hopeful that you'll want to come live with me and my family in Maine. How would you like that, Tommy?" I shrugged.
"You have kids?"
"I do," Elijah said with excitement, pulling out his phone. He showed me a picture of his family. "That's my wife, Nora," he said, pointing to a petite, black-haired woman in a red and white dress, smiling brightly at the camera. "That's my daughter, Ivy," he said, pointing to a teenage girl about my age with her father's wavy light brown hair. Although she was smiling, the gesture didn't reach her eyes. They were hard, almost fearful.
And that's my son, Jackson.
The boy looked to be about 8, with his mother's dark hair and a mischievous grin on his face. I nodded, not really sure what to think.
So what do you say?
Elijah asked.
Want to come live with us? Well, let's not get ahead of ourselves,
Mrs. Young said.
You and I need to discuss some things before we ask Thomas what he wants. Oh, right,
my uncle said, embarrassed.
My mistake. Well, it's so good to meet you, Tommy. You look so much like your mother. Again, I'm so sorry for your loss. I can't imagine what you must be feeling right now.
Mrs. Young sent me out of the room so the adults could discuss whatever it was they needed to discuss. 3 days later, I got on an airplane for the first time in my life and flew to Maine with my uncle. Mrs. Young in New York and another social worker in Maine were going to work jointly on the case. I was going to live with the Tuckers for a year as a kind of trial run. Social workers in Maine would make a few visits over the year to see how things were going, and we'd go from there. Elijah was nice and friendly for the plane ride, but once we were no longer around people, it was as if a switch had been flipped. The slight smile he'd been wearing on his face since I first met him was suddenly gone. His face was blank, and he stopped speaking to me as we drove out of Bangor, heading north. At first, I didn't really register the change. I thought he was tired from the traveling. But when I asked him if we could pull over so I could pee, he turned to me in the dim interior of the car and smiled widely. Then he threw his head back and roared with laughter. The abruptness of it made me jump on my seat. He laughed for a long time, until tears flowed down his cheeks. When I thought he was going to stop, he glanced over at me and laughed even harder. My heart beat heavily in my chest as I stared at the man, not really believing what was happening. His insane laughter filled the car, making me feel like I was losing my mind. Then, after what must have been a full 3 minutes of laughter, he stopped abruptly. He simply faced forward, looking out at the road, his cheeks still gleaming with moisture. I could do nothing but stare at him, my mouth hanging slightly open. A black cloud of fear expanded out from my gut, filling my body like poison. 30 minutes passed. We got off the main highway and onto a 2-lane road through sparsely populated land. My urge to pee intensified with every passing mile, eventually overtaking my fear. With my mind focused on holding in my pee, the laughing fit began to seem like a strange misunderstanding. Maybe he'd hear me say something else, something he thought was funny. Finally, when I was about to burst, I turned to my uncle again. "Sorry," I said in a meek voice, "but I really need to pee. Can we pull over?" This time, he didn't even acknowledge that he'd heard me. He simply kept driving. "Uncle Elijah," I said, a little louder, "I really need to pee." This time he looked over with a small smile on his face. "Can't wait for you to see the house and meet the family. They're gonna love you." The pressure was building. I could barely contain it. I was about to burst. "Did you not hear me?" I asked. "I need..." My bladder released, warm wetness soaking my jeans and the faux leather seat. I tried to stop it, but I couldn't. The ammonia smell of urine filled the car. I looked down at my crotch, unable to believe I had just pissed myself. An overwhelming urge to cry flooded me, and the dam released. I burst into tears for the first time since I'd gotten the news that my mother died.
Jesus Christ,
Elijah said, looking over at me.
Did you just pee your pants?
He jerked the wheel and hit the brakes, pulling over onto the shoulder.
Get out!
He shouted.
Get out of the car!
I opened my door and stepped out, still crying. The urine that had pooled under me traveled down my legs, now cold, the freezing Maine wind making it even colder.
Jesus fucking Christ! Why didn't you say something?
Elijah yelled, getting out of his seat and going to the trunk. He came around to my side with a roll of blue automotive paper towels. He used a wad of them to try and clean the front passenger seat, while I stood in the wild grass at the side of the road, wet and shivering and crying. We pulled up in front of a Victorian-style 2-story house set in the middle of a thick forest. There were no other houses visible in any direction. The house was clearly old, but seemed well cared for. There was no garage, so Elijah guided the car into a spot in the gravel driveway next to a crossover SUV. He kept the engine running and looked over at me.
Listen, I'm sorry for getting mad at you back there. I wish you'd said something.
I wanted to open my mouth and tell him that I had said something, but I'd been on the verge of tears ever since Elijah had me change clothes on the side of the road, watching me even as I changed my underwear. I was afraid if I opened my mouth, I would start crying again. He sighed heavily and shut off the engine.
Let's go meet the family.
We got out of the car and went to the trunk to grab our bags. Most of my stuff was being shipped and was supposed to arrive in a couple of days, but I had a backpack and a suitcase with me.
Don't forget your wet clothes,
Elijah said, pointing to the urine-soaked clothes I'd put in a plastic grocery bag Elijah had in the car. Can I bring them in later? I asked, not wanting my new family to know I'd peed myself.
No, bring them in now,
he said. I grabbed them and we walked up to the front door of the house. Elijah, with his single bag in his left hand, unlocked the door with his right. We stepped inside to see the rest of the family arrayed before us in the entryway next to the stairs. They stood in a line, all of them smiling except Ivy, the teenage girl.
Welcome, Tommy,
Nora said.
He pissed himself in the car,
Elijah said. My stomach dropped and I almost bolted out the door, but I didn't. I had nowhere to go. I watched the expressions of my new family members change. Disgust flickered on their faces, but there was something else in Ivy's expression too. Something like understanding, I thought.
Ew,
Jackson said. That seemed to snap Nora out of it. Her expression changed to one of pity, and she stepped forward.
You poor boy. Why didn't you ask your uncle to stop at a restroom? He's had a hard time of it,
Elijah said, cutting me off.
His mom just died, remember? We'll have to practice a little forgiveness. Isn't that right, kids?
Jackson chuckled but nodded. Ivy just averted her eyes, looking at the floor.
Ivy?
Elijah asked.
Isn't that right?
Yes, Daddy, she said, not looking at him.
Good. Now, I think you should probably take a shower, Tommy. Jackson and Ivy will show you your room and the bathroom.
It's okay, Nora said, rubbing my arm. You're okay now. Don't hesitate to ask for anything, all right? Anything at all. I nodded and then followed Jackson and Ivy upstairs. Jackson talked incessantly about the house and about how I wasn't allowed to go into his room and how he'd never wanted a brother. When we reached the top of the creaky stairs, we started down a wide hallway with doors on both sides and a window at the end. Jackson pointed out his room on the right and Ivy's on the left. Then the bathroom on the right. Ivy was silent the whole time, looking at her feet as we went down the hallway.
Your room is upstairs,
Jackson said with a smirk.
I'll show you.
We went to the end of the hall where there was a stairwell on the left, right across from Elijah and Nora's bedroom. It led up to an unfinished attic that was separated into two different parts. The exterior part at the top of the stairs was cluttered with boxes and storage bins. Then there was a wall with a door in the middle of it. Jackson opened the door, its hinges squealing faintly, to reveal a sparse makeshift bedroom with a bed in the left corner and a dresser in the right. The unfinished flooring was splintery, and the walls didn't have any sheetrock on them. Between the exposed beams were strips of old insulation. A small window set in the wall between the bed and dresser looked out onto the side of the property.
Here it is,
Jackson said.
Enjoy!
He skipped out of the room and down the stairs to the second floor. Ivy remained, and I looked at her, unable to hide the dismay on my face at my new abode. At first, she didn't look at me. But when Jackson's sounds faded away, she raised her face and met my gaze.
Be careful, she said. Don't make them mad. Do whatever they say. What do you mean? I asked.
Tommy?
Nora shouted from below. I heard her feet on the attic steps as she came up. Ivy turned and moved swiftly out of the room. She and her mother met at the top of the stairs. Nora grabbed her daughter by the arm and leaned into her ear, whispering something I couldn't make out. But the whole time Nora was whispering to her daughter, she was staring at me. That night, as I lay awake in the bed in the freezing attic, I heard the soft squeal of the door opening. I was facing away from the wall, so all I had to do was look down to see Elijah standing in the doorway, faintly backlit from the other light over the attic stairs. I propped myself up on one elbow.
Uncle Elijah?
He made no move and said nothing. He only stood there, staring at me, a faint smile on his face.
Is everything okay?
I asked. Still nothing. The urge to cry swelled inside me, but I pushed it down. I was living a nightmare. I laid back down and pulled the scratchy wool blanket up over my head. When I peeked out from the blanket more than 10 minutes later, Elijah was still standing there in the doorway. He hadn't moved at all. Well, that's not strictly true, because instead of smiling softly, he was now grinning at me. I thought about running away several times over the course of the next week, but the only reason I didn't was because it was freezing outside and I had no money. Plus, I didn't know what had happened to my heavy jacket. I had packed it into my suitcase and had even worn it as we walked out of the Bangor airport, only taking it off when the heater made me hot in the car. I was fairly certain I had left it in the back of Elijah's car, but when I asked him about it, he said he didn't know where it was. I thought about stealing one of Elijah's jackets and running away, but it seemed there was always someone around, watching me, keeping me from snooping around the house. They'd also taken my phone away, saying that they didn't let their kids have phones outside of designated times. But I didn't know when those times were, and I never saw Ivy or Jackson with a phone. Otherwise, things were fairly normal. I got to know Ivy a little bit better because she would come and talk to me whenever her parents were busy with something else. She asked about my mother and about my life in New York, marveling as I told her about life outside of Maine. She seemed kind, sweet, and shy, but I didn't get much from her. When I asked about her life, she always seemed to change the subject. I'd heard Elijah mention that he worked from home, although he'd taken time off after he heard about my mother's death. I also learned that Nora homeschooled the kids and that I would be homeschooled too. But there was no school during that first week. Nora doted on me and made sure I got enough to eat. When I complained about how cold it was in the attic, she said she would get Elijah to do something about it. There was a closed door in the upstairs hallway, leading to a room I had never been inside. When I asked Jackson about it, he said that we weren't allowed to go in there. In one of the rare times when no one was around, I tried to open the door, but it was locked. The night before the main social worker was scheduled to visit the house, I lay in my bed, trying to sleep because of the cold. Elijah hadn't yet done anything about the attic, but it had only been a few days, so I tried to have faith. I thought that maybe Elijah didn't actually want me around and was trying to get me to run away or something. But if I could make Nora and the kids like me, maybe he would warm up to me. As I lay there, trying to sleep, I heard the sound of my door opening. I had heard that sound every single night since I'd been in the house. And for the first 3 nights, I'd look up to see Elijah standing there. After that, I stopped looking up, instead keeping my eyes closed and pretending like nothing was wrong. It made for restless sleep, and I'd barely gotten more than 4 hours a night since arriving. But on this particular night, I was surprised by Ivy's voice whispering my name shortly after my door opened. I opened my eyes to see her standing next to my bed in her pajamas, looking frightened. "What is it?" I asked, sitting up. She looked at me for a long moment before hugging me tightly. "Please don't leave," she whispered in my ear. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though I knew. "Tomorrow, when the social worker comes, you're going to tell them about my dad, aren't you? About the strange things he does." It was the first time since back when my mother was alive that I'd been genuinely hugged. Nora often touched my arm, but she never hugged me. And Elijah never touched me at all, which I didn't mind one bit. So I melted into that hug, feeling a personal connection I hadn't known I'd been yearning for. "I won't tell them anything," I said. Ivy broke the hug and looked into my eyes. "Promise? Because if you don't tell them anything, we can run away together when it gets warmer. I know where my parents keep cash in the house. We can take it and run in the spring. Please, I can't stand it here anymore, but I don't know what will happen if you leave." "It's okay," I said. "I'll stay. We'll leave together, I promise." Ivy was near tears, but she smiled at me. "Thank you. You're the best thing to ever happen to me." I watched my cousin leave the room, shutting the door behind her. When the door opened again later, I didn't even mind so much. I knew Elijah was standing there staring at me, but I fell asleep soon after that anyway.
I need to talk to you,
Elijah said as I came out of the bathroom the next morning. I'd just finished showering and getting ready for the day. The big meeting was just an hour away, and I was nervous about it. After what Ivy said last night, I was afraid I would let something slip. Then again, there wasn't really anything that could strictly be called abuse going on. The thing in the car had been strange, sure, and the way Elijah came to my room every night was definitely creepy. But there could be logical explanations for those things. Elijah could simply say I never asked him to pull over so I could pee. It would be my word against his. And about the watching me sleep thing, he could just say he wanted to make sure I was safe and sound. But as I followed him down the hall, I thought about my room upstairs. It clearly wasn't livable, and I was sure the social worker would want to see where I was sleeping. Then Elijah stopped at the mystery door in the hall, the one that was always locked. He pulled a key out and unlocked the door. Then he pushed the door open and turned on the light. It looked like my room at home. My posters were on the walls, and the rest of my clothes were in the closet. There was a bed made up with the same blanket I'd had for years.
Wow,
I said, thinking that my stuff had only just arrived yesterday and that they'd been keeping it a secret to surprise me. I stepped into the room and looked around. My books were on a small bookshelf above my desk. My random knickknacks were placed around. Behind me, Elijah shut the door.
Pretty nice, huh?
He asked.
Yeah,
I said.
Looks great. I'm looking forward to sleeping here tonight. It's freezing in the attic.
Elijah laughed.
Oh, you won't be sleeping here tonight. This isn't your room. Not until you earn it.
I looked at him, my face falling.
What?
Elijah sat on the bed and patted the space next to him. I glanced at the closed door and then back at my uncle.
Come on,
he said.
Take a seat. We need to have a little talk.
Reluctantly, I sat next to him, leaving plenty of space between us. But he scooted over so our thighs were touching. He wrapped an arm around my shoulders and put his face close to mine.
You're going to tell the social worker that you've been sleeping in this room since you arrived here, right?
What? I asked.
You're going to tell her that you've been having a good time here, right?
I said nothing.
Because if you don't,
Elijah said,
I'll have to take it out on Ivy.
I did a poor job of hiding the shock on my face. Elijah grinned and nodded.
You two have become close, haven't you? She's always been strong-headed, that one. She has a mind of her own, kind of like your mother did. But if you do anything to make that social worker think we're not a good fit for you, I will make Ivy's life a living hell. I'll put her in the basement. You know what's in the basement?
Swallowing, I shook my head.
No, of course not. But Ivy does. She's been in the basement many times. And you can hear her screams all through the house. Do you understand me?
I nodded. With his free hand, Elijah grabbed my leg just above my knee and dug his fingers into my flesh.
Say yes.
Yes, I said, gasping against the pain in my leg.
Good,
He said, letting go.
good.
He walked out of the room and shut the door behind him. Elijah and Nora stepped back inside the house after seeing the social worker off. Ivy, Jackson, and I stood in the doorway. I listened to the faint sound of the woman's car driving off, and I had a terrible feeling that I'd missed my chance to get out of this hellish house. I had actually started to believe that things would be good until Elijah took me into that room upstairs. The room that was supposed to be mine, but really wasn't. The only reason I hadn't said anything to the social worker while she talked to me one-on-one was because of Ivy. I didn't want to get her hurt. And since I had done what he asked, I expected Elijah to be grateful. He and Nora smiled as they moved across to us from the front door. But as Nora stepped in front of me, her smile fell from her face like a building collapsing during a controlled demolition. She slapped me so hard that I stumbled and fell to the floor.
Don't!
Ivy screamed, falling to her knees next to me.
I didn't tell her anything!
I said, tears blurring my vision.
Go to your room, the one in the attic.
Nora said, pointing up the stairs.
What's wrong with you?
Ivy screamed. Elijah stepped up and lifted his daughter by the neck. The sight of it sent me over the edge. I scrambled up and lunged for him, but Elijah saw it coming. He tossed Ivy aside and punched me in the stomach. My breath rushed out of me and I fell to the floor. Jackson came up and kicked me several times, laughing as he did so.
Go to your room!
Nora screamed. I got painfully to my feet and made my way up to the attic, curling up into the bed, fully clothed. My tears soaked the pillow, the wet spot turning cold quickly in the drafty attic. That night, I lay in my bed, shivering after hearing footsteps and whispering from outside my door. I heard my door open but remained facing the wall, waiting for them to go away. Time passed, so much that I thought they had gone. I shifted in the bed, turning to look, and saw 3 figures standing behind me, right next to my bed. They were all dressed in their pajamas, and they were all smiling at me. Elijah leaned over the bed, reaching his hands toward me. Nora stood with her hands on Jackson's shoulders. The only one who wasn't there was Ivy. Gasping, I scrambled away from them until my back hit the wall the bed was up against.
What?
I asked, nearly crying.
What now?
They didn't say anything. They simply kept smiling, grinning. Elijah grabbed me by my t-shirt and yanked me out of the bed.
It's time,
He said, standing me up and grabbing me by the back of the neck.
for you to go to the basement.
But I didn't do anything!
I said.
I did what you asked!
Elijah just smiled and shoved me toward the door.
Don't make this worse on yourself. Go.
Jackson broke away from his mother and started jumping and spinning in the room, saying,
The basement!
repeatedly in an excited voice. Elijah gave me a shove, and I stumbled out of the attic room, headed toward the stairs to the second floor. Jackson danced down the stairs ahead of me.
Tommy's going to the basement!
He chanted.
Ivy!
I shouted.
Help me! Don't let them do this! Oh, sweetie.
Nora said from behind me.
Ivy's already in the basement.
My heart dropped at those words.
Oh no.
I said. Tears sprung up in my eyes as I walked down the stairs to the first floor and headed toward the basement door. When I reached the door, it was closed and locked. Nora stepped in front of me, retrieving a single key from a pocket. Jackson snickered behind me. I sensed Elijah stepping up behind me, but before I could turn, I felt a prick at my neck. I brought my hand up and turned around. Elijah stood there with an empty syringe in his hand, grinning at me.
What was in that?
I asked.
What did you put in me? Tommy?
Ivy called from the basement.
Please help me.
I could tell she was crying. Elijah turned to me with one hand and gave me a shove through the basement door. Nora slammed and locked the door behind me, thrusting the stairwell into near total darkness.
Ivy?
I called.
Down here.
She said.
Please help me. They won't leave me alone. Who?
I asked, still standing at the top of the stairs. There was no answer. As my eyes adjusted slowly, I made my way down the stairs, moving tentatively. I felt a slight head change from whatever Elijah had injected me with, like a low-key buzz, but that was about it. I didn't feel much different. That didn't keep my heart from pounding so hard I felt sick. I'd never been in the basement, and I didn't know what was waiting for me. Still, I moved down until my feet touched the cold concrete floor. The room was nothing but varying shades of shadows. Only that wasn't exactly right. As my eyes adjusted more, I could see that the space was draped in pieces of irregular black cloth, only allowing me to see a few feet in any direction.
Watch out for them!
Ivy called from somewhere over to the right.
They want to hurt us. Where are you?
I asked.
Over here, in the corner.
As I started that way, I noticed that some of the pieces of black cloth were moving to my left. I looked that way and saw a black-robed figure racing toward me, knocking the pieces of cloth aside as it came. A sharp cry of fear escaped me as I turned to run away from the thing, whatever it was. I batted the pieces of cloth aside, heading toward where I thought Ivy was. Another black figure came racing out of the darkness from the other side of the basement, although this one was shorter than the first. A loud screeching sound came from overhead, compounding my fear. But as I angled away from this second figure, I caught a glimpse of something strange. Something that registered in a faraway place of my mind, just barely piercing the veil of fear that had fallen so heavily over my mind.
Over here!
Ivy said, and I saw her not far away. Her short, silk nightdress relatively bright against the darkness of the rest of the room. As I reached her, she grabbed my hands and pulled me into the corner, where there was a twin mattress with a blanket and a single pillow on it. Glancing over my shoulder, I saw no evidence of the two black-clad figures. Then I thought about what I'd seen as that second figure raced toward me. I'd caught a glimpse of color under the black robe, a glimpse of a pink sock on a petite foot. Nora's foot, I was sure of it. I was sure she'd been wearing pink socks to match her pink pajamas while leading me down to the basement. Before I could think much more about this revelation, Ivy wrapped me in a hug.
I'm so glad you're here,
She said.
I need your help. What's going on?
I asked.
What is this? I need you to protect me.
She said, pulling my face toward hers and kissing me. She pressed herself to me and started undulating her hips. I shoved her away and she fell onto the mattress.
What are you doing?
I said.
You're my cousin. It's okay.
She said, reaching for me.
It's okay, I promise. Plenty of cultures do this.
I stepped back, thinking of the pink sock.
No,
I said.
No, this is not okay. This is fucked up.
Ivy paused, her expression hardening.
It's not working,
She shouted.
You didn't give him enough.
God damn it!
Elijah shouted from elsewhere in the basement. Acting on instinct fueled by anger, I turned and ran away from the corner, away from Ivy.
He's running!
Ivy called.
He can't get out!
Elijah answered, his voice closer.
Where is he?
Nora called out from ahead of me.
Which way? I think he's coming toward you, Mom.
Ivy answered. A moment later, I saw Nora moving cautiously, still wearing the black robes. I could tell it was her by her stature, even though I couldn't see her pink socks because she wasn't running. I didn't slow down. I ran toward her as fast as I could. She noticed me and turned to run, but I was already moving too fast. I shoved her in the back, and she flew forward and smacked into a wall half obscured by black cloth. She collapsed to the floor, and I got down next to her, flipping her robes up and digging into her pocket for the key to the basement door. I knew there had to be some other way to get down to the basement. Elijah and Nora hadn't come down the same way as me, but I didn't have time to go searching for it. So I grabbed the key and ran toward the stairwell.
Nora?
Elijah called from nearby.
Nora, are you okay?
I darted up the stairs, reaching the door just as I heard someone behind me. It was Elijah, and he'd taken off his disguise. His face was twisted with anger as he bolted toward me. I fumbled with the key, getting it into the lock, but knowing I didn't have time to open the door before Elijah reached me. I turned and kicked out as hard as I could, catching Elijah in the throat as he came up toward me. I felt a couple of my toes break with the impact, but it had the desired effect. Elijah stopped short and grabbed his neck, gasping for air. He stepped backward and lost his footing, tumbling hard down the stairs. I unlocked the door, stepped through, and then locked it from the other side. Then I ran limping upstairs into the master bedroom and searched madly for car keys. I found some in a dresser drawer and dashed back to the stairs, only to see Jackson standing at the bottom of the stairwell, looking up at me. I could faintly hear Ivy screaming for her mother to wake up in the basement. Rushing down the stairs, I shoved Jackson out of the way. He hit the floor hard and started crying as I made it out the front door and got into Elijah's car. Although my mom hadn't owned a car before she died, she'd rented one so she could teach me how to drive as soon as I was eligible to get my learner's permit. Although we hadn't logged enough hours for me to get my license before she died, she'd taught me how to drive pretty well. I sped away from that house in Elijah's car, headed for the nearest police station. As I sat in the Bangor police station, I listened to my mother's voice playing on a recording on a stranger's cell phone. And as I listened, everything came together. All I'd been through started to make some kind of twisted sense. "I plan to tell you all this myself one day when you're older," my mom said on the recording. "But I can't guarantee that my brother won't do something stupid. He bought all my mother and father's bullshit hook, line, and sinker. He even married our cousin Nora, because that's what their fucked up religion told him to do. And they tried to get me to marry Nora's brother Nathan just before my 16th birthday. Only it wasn't just marriage. They wanted me to... Anyway, I don't want to talk about that. It was a bad time, and it was a miracle I got out of there when I did. But I'm getting ahead of myself. If you're hearing this, it's because something has happened to me, and I'm not there to tell you myself. If that's the case, know that I love you, Tommy, so much. I would do anything to protect you, which is why I've been building up your tolerance to a special cocktail of hallucinogens they use for their disgusting little rituals. I've been slipping it into your food a little bit at a time, because if something happens to me, I'm sure Elijah will try to take you. I'm sure he'll try to get you to have a child with his daughter, because to fail at that would be to fail as a father, at least in his eyes. It's the most important thing a father can do in that religion. It's truly disgusting. I endured so much abuse from my father. We both did, really. But the girls always have it harder in my family. They try to make you think you're crazy. They try to beat you down so you have no more will anymore. And then they build you back up in the way that they want. It's child abuse, plain and simple. Which is why I ran away. I didn't ever plan on having kids, really. But when you came along, all that changed. I love you so much. I knew I had to do something to protect you. So hopefully this works. Hopefully, my last will and testament gets to the right people before Elijah swoops in. But most of all, I hope I can be around for a long time more so you don't have to worry about any of this. But I'm not taking that chance. So if you hear this, remember not to trust Elijah or Nora. Don't trust anyone who says they're related to you. They only mean you harm. The recording ended, and I handed the phone back to the woman to whom it belonged.
So you really knew my mother?
I asked her, still processing the words I'd just heard.
How come I never met you? I was her lawyer,
the woman said.
and I'm so sorry I didn't hear about her death right away. I was on vacation at the time.
She shrugged.
Bad timing, I guess. But now we'll get it all sorted out. I just hope you're okay. I heard you had quite the ordeal.
I nodded.
Yeah, I did. But thanks to my mom, I got out of it.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy these stories, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and check out some more of my episodes here.